Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So we're going to talk about supply and demand. In order to do that, we have to define what a market is, and that's what we're working towards. Remember, the supply and demand model is the workhorse model in economics, and that's what we're going to build up here in order to talk about how markets function. But first, we want to think about what a market is. A market is the combination of buyers and sellers and the institutions that bring them together. So sometimes we haven't met this word institution before. And what we mean by institution is something fairly specific in this case. What I mean by institution is an arrangement. And in fact, we can even say that, or arrangement. Institution in this case, we mean it. You might have heard a phrase like the institution of marriage, or the the institution of property rights, and we're going to use those kind of terminology as we go forward. This is really important in like macroeconomics, but we'll see it some here in microeconomics as well. Okay, so a market then is buyers and sellers and the institution or arrangement that brings them together. Okay, so let's think about some examples of that. When you say market, you might have heard of things like a farmer's market. That absolutely is a market, right? It's a pretty small market, relatively few sellers and not particularly many buyers. We can also think of like really large ones. eBay would be a good example. But we really also want to think more broadly than that. We might want to think about the market for shoes, for example. Now, the market for shoes, when we think about it this way, is a market that functions over a very wide geographic space. So the examples that we have here are interesting because they highlight it can be sort of a physical market, like a farmer's market, like a classic use of a word market. It can be something digital, eBay, Amazon, you probably buy from online retailers. Those are all markets. And then we often also use a market for blank, and then that is buyers and sellers coming together, and there's often institutional arrangements that bring them together. So there's some examples of a market. So what I really want us to think about when we're working through markets, through demand, through supply, is the first thing we think about anytime we go to buy something. And that, of course, is price. So first thing we think about when buying, and of course I say buying, but this would also be the first thing you think about when selling, is the price, right? And there are many other factors. I'm not saying this is the only thing that we're thinking about, right? We're thinking about availability. We're thinking about, options. If there's something that you're wanting to buy, you want to buy a car, you're thinking about what your various options are. But the very first thing that we think about is price. And we do this for an important reason, and that's because prices do two important things. Prices do two important things. And that is what we're going to start with today. The first thing is that prices convey information on how buyers value the good or service. Prices convey information on how buyers value good and service. So this is the first time that we've seen, first time we've seen this phrase, good or service. So good or service in this case, that's just any of the things that we can end up buying and selling. These are intentionally broad, right? Like physical goods or a service that you'd be paying for. When I used to teach this back in graduate school, I would always ask students, pick an example, almost like challenging them to pick something that you couldn't come up with. I usually limited them from financial examples just because the markets for those are kind of weird. But remember, we talked about in the ideas video the availability of things matters. That's what we're talking about here. The price of something conveys the way that buyers value something, this goods and services, or anything that we might find to be made available. This idea about information on how buyers value a good or service is related to what we call demand, and that's what I'm going to develop today. The other thing that prices do is convey information on how costly it is to produce a good or service. And remember, this is that same opportunity cost. So again, value of alternative uses. And that opportunity cost is also contained in the demand. But this is related to the idea of supply. Okay? So what markets end up doing is they convey information to people who want to buy and people who want to sell. In the act of bringing them together, that information then gets developed and conveyed so that the different parties to the situation know the relevant information. And in fact, it doesn't seem like that often, right? And you may not think about a price as something that says, oh, when I see this particular price, then I think about the value of its alternative uses, or I think about the way that buyers value it. Not in so many words, but you probably have that intuition, right? So you think, well, if I go and I want to buy, a good example here in recent times is toilet paper, right? And the price of that is really high. That might be because many people value it very highly. And we'll talk about those kind of examples as we work throughout the class. So one of the most important things that can be taught in any micro class is this function of prices. This is going to be a huge component of everything that we do in this class, and that's because this idea that prices do two important things is going to permeate the entirety of the class. Okay, so now let's talk about demand. Okay, so the first thing is, what does it mean to demand a product? That's how we're using the word demand here. And this is related to being both willing and able to purchase something. So you think to yourself, would you be willing to purchase a yacht? And perhaps you would, but you may not be able to. And so in that sense, the market doesn't register your demand, right? On the other hand, you may be very able to purchase something, but unwilling to do so. Perhaps you see a shirt, you could afford it, but you don't like that color, so you don't buy it. Your demand doesn't register in that market, okay? So we want to tie this idea of price in right away. What happens when price rises? Well, it turns out that you are less likely to buy it in that case. Okay, so that information that's been conveyed by price has a predictable relationship between you and your willingness and ability to purchase a good. And that could be for either of those reasons, notice, right? You could be just as willing but less able, or you could be just as able but less willing, right? So that's, again, that opportunity cost idea. Okay, so let's think a little bit about what we call a demand schedule. And all I'm trying to do here is get us to two things. One is sort of a graphical way to think about markets. I'm going to develop that throughout this class. We're going to build that up and use that as sort of a workhorse model the rest of the way. But I also want to help visualize it, right? So this is what we call a schedule. So a schedule, the relationship between price and quantity. So demand and supply are both going to be the relationship between price and quantity, and that's going to be really important here in a second when we talk about determinants. Okay, so suppose that you observe that when the price is $200. Let's say you're watching your friend over the course of a summer and you're seeing, well, how many tickets does he buy at the different price points? So if the price is $200, he doesn't buy any. If the price is $180, then he buys 5. And if the price is $160, he ends up buying 10. We can kind of see this linear relationship develop. So the point of supply and demand is to graph the way that the consumers end up relating price to quantity and then how the producers are going to do that. So I've drawn this setup here in order to get us just a simple graphic representation of what demand is going to look like. Okay, so the price is going to be 200 or 180 or 160, right? And if the price is 200, we end up buying 0. So the quantity, right? This is the market for tickets here. If the price is 180, then we see them buy 5. And if the price is 160, we see your friend buy 10. That gives us our little demand curve. Let's graph it, right? Because presumably they would end up buying similar amounts at in-between prices. This is representative of what a demand curve looks like. And the key here is that it's downward sloping. Right? So what happens when you're teaching this course is you want to visualize demand and you want to talk about it being downward sloping, and that has all these nice features for what we'll talk about later on in the class. But at the end of the day, what's really important about that is that the intuition is that when price rises, you're less likely to buy something. Right? So that's what I want you to be able to see with a downward sloping demand curve, is that you're going to end up with a set of relationships between price and quantity that show that as the price of something goes up, as we can see that here, the amount that we want to consume goes down. That's the relationship, sometimes called the law of demand. And so that is the big takeaway from demand curves. Okay, so now that we sort of understand principal idea here is how price and quantity relate to each other. That's what we're thinking about with demand. We want to talk about what might move the demand curve around, and this is what we call determinants of demand. So there, remember we said a minute ago, many things are factoring into your decision whether or not you want to buy something. We're saying probably the first thing, the most important thing, is price. It's not always the case that that's the most important thing. And these determinants of demand are going to help us think about other factors that come into play. Okay, so we've seen that graphical representation. So determinants of demand change the price-quantity relationship. And that's sort of the shape of the demand curve, or the location of the demand curve. Change the price-quantity relationship of demand. Another way to think about that is that it moves or shifts. Shifts is just another way to say it. Shifts the demand curve. Okay, so same intuition, right? How steep is the fall off as price goes up in how much we want? That depends on other factors. These are those other factors, okay? So factors that change the relationship between price and quantity in demand. Okay, so the first one is what we call tastes. Economists really like the word preferences. Those are the same idea here. So what taste says is if you, for some reason, like one good more than another, in some sense, there's no explaining that, right? I love chocolate chip cookies, right? It's just a thing that I like. I'm willing to pay more of them. If they're at a certain price, then I want more of chocolate chip cookies, one of my favorite desserts. I have a friend who doesn't like chocolate at all, right? You might know some people like this. In general, people like chocolate. My friend's taste and preference for chocolate chip cookies is just lower than mine. And he might eat one once in a great while, right? But the amount of chocolate chip cookies that he wants, or the amount that the price would have to lower in order to induce him to buy a chocolate chip cookie, is much, much lower than me, right? And this works for any other application. But in general, the way that we're going to think about these preferences is what happens when the taste or preference for something changes. What happens when the determinant changes? So in this case, suppose that your taste or preference changed. A good example of this for me is coffee. I never used to drink coffee. It's a thing that mature adults do. So all through grad school, I'd always try it like once a year, and I never liked it. One time, I had ordered a hot chocolate, I think at like Starbucks, and they accidentally put some espresso in there. That is what you call a white mocha, which is just hot chocolate with espresso in it. And I quite liked it, so I kind of eased my way in. So now I'm drinking coffee in a very diluted form. No judgment, by the way. White mochas are delicious, right? My wife is quite the experimenter in the kitchen, is how I'll describe that. She's very, very talented, but she also really likes to take new recipes and try new things. So she was really excited I started drinking white mochas, and she sort of, unbeknownst to me, transitioned me to my morning coffee being more of a latte, right? Thinner milks in it and less syrups and sugars and that kind of thing. Over the course of this past year, she's essentially tricked me into becoming a coffee drinker, and now I will routinely, every day if I'm not careful, drink cups of coffee that are just cream and sugar in there, like the mature adult I guess I always wanted to be. So my taste over a recent time period for coffee has increased dramatically. That is going to be related to my demand curve shifting upward. Okay, so what does that mean then intuitively? So let's take a look at it. We have this relationship between price and quantity, okay? And we had this old demand curve of mine, right? So here's all the relationships between price and quantity that I used to have, right? And now my demand curve has increased, right? And so I'm going to draw that as a rightward shift. We're going to do that. It's less important for demand, but it's important in this moment, right? My demand has increased. It has shifted away from the axis, away from the origin. Well, how is it that we can see that is an increase in demand? Well, suppose we had some relationship between price. If the price was price one, so what's a cup of coffee cost at a coffee shop? It might be $5 roughly, right? And so the amount that I would want initially was, let's say, once a month, right? But now I like coffee much more. I like many more types of coffee, and my demand has shifted outward. Well, at that same price, right, now I want a higher amount of coffee. So perhaps I drink, let's be honest, right, probably drinking like at least one a week. Maybe that number is higher, but I'll maintain my dignity for a moment, right? So this is what it looks like for taste to increase, causing demand to increase. We see that at the same price, then we would want more of the good. We're more likely to buy it, right? So that's the way to think about these things. So there's your first determinant. For the sake of expediency, I'm not going to work through all of these graphical examples, but I do want to talk through all the determinants, okay? The second one is one that you probably guessed, right? And that's income. Actually, let me get a better notation here. Let's keep it consistent. Income. And we denote that as Y. Now, the problem with income is there are two different types of goods, right? And these are what we call normal and inferior goods. Normal and inferior. So a normal good is something that when you have more income goes up, you demand more of that good. You buy more of it, right? So perhaps shoes would be a good example of this, right? You make a little bit more money. Perhaps instead of one particular type of dress shoe that you're going to wear to work, you end up having two, or those cowboy boots that you always wanted and you never bought. Now you buy them when your income goes up. But we also have what are called inferior goods. And inferior goods are subject to this idea of substitution. So when our income goes up, our demand for that good ends up going down. The quintessential example of this are like foods that people typically don't love but are pretty cheap, right? So the college student example is always ramen. So if I am a poor college student, I'm just making ends meet, I end up needing to eat ramen in order to make the budget work out. When you get your first big job, you're never eating ramen again, and now you're eating steak every night, right? So normal good, steak might be normal. As income goes up, you eat more steaks. Now notice that some of you are probably listening to this saying, I don't like steak. And that's perfectly valid. That's a function of those taste and preferences that we talked about first. So taste and preferences will moderate all of these other things, okay? So we've got tastes and we've got income. Income's sort of the trickiest one in the bunch because you have normal goods and you have inferior goods. Okay? Our next determinant is what we call price of complements. Really just complements in general. So these are complements as in things that are go together. They're complements, not as in to pay someone a compliment. So a complement is something that you consume along with another good. Right. So what are some good examples? Hot dogs and buns. Right. Maybe graham crackers and marshmallows. I can't spell graham cracker. Graham crackers, marshmallows, right? If you're socks and shoes, cars and gasoline, peanut butter and jelly. Hopefully you at home while you're watching this are thinking about a bunch of examples that fit in nicely here. Things consumed together. So what happens when you're going to grill out and you go to get the hot dogs and the buns are really expensive? So what happens when the price of a complement, P sub C, goes up? Well, your demand for the other good ends up going down, right? So I'm saying, let's think about the demand for hot dogs. What happens if the price of buns goes through the roof, right? So it's sort of easiest to think about it if we think about sort of this extreme example. But since we have graphed the increase, let's graph one of these examples that shows us what a decrease looks like. So you have this initial level of demand, and then the price of a complement increases, and so the amount that we want falls. What does that end up looking like? It's that same idea from before. So if there was some initial price that led you to consume a certain amount, right? So what does a six-pack of hot dogs cost? Probably also around that $5 mark. Right? And that caused you once a month to go out and grill some hot dogs up. Maybe this is your average over the year, since you'll probably do that more during the summer, but less during the winter. When your demand falls because the price of buns goes up, the frequency with which you end up consuming the hot dogs is lower. So now like a half time per month. Instead of once a month, you do it every other month on average, right? So that's the idea of a complement. So just think about if the price of gasoline goes up, how much people are willing to pay for cars is going to go down. Lots of good examples there. Okay. The other idea is actually, the next idea is actually sort of related to that. And this is what we call price of substitutes. In fact, some people that teach this course call these related goods, right? They say complements and substitutes are both goods related to the consumption of something, and so you want to teach them together. So what are good examples of substitutes? These are things you'll consume instead of something else. Coke and Pepsi, kind of the classic example, right? You've probably never, and if you have, please let me know because I'd find this very interesting. You probably never sat down and had the option to pick between Coke and Pepsi. Of course, Coke and Pepsi are competitors and are substitutes, so most restaurants aren't going to have both. I don't know if I've ever seen that. But imagine that scenario. You say, I'd like a drink with my steak that I'm eating at this restaurant here. And they say, what'll you have? You say, well, do you have Coke or Pepsi products? And they say both. You're not going to order both, right? If you go to the grocery store, you're going to pick up some Coke products or Pepsi products to go with your hot dogs that you're going to grill and watch the ball game. You're not going to pick Coke and Pepsi, right? You're going to pick one or the other. That's because they're substitutes, okay? So substitutes are things that we would consume in place of each other rather than together, okay? So things consumed. I'll just say instead because I think that's clear enough. You can make a note to yourself in your own notes if you want a little more of a descriptor there. So what happens when the price of a substitute goes up? And it may actually be easier to think about this when it goes down, but let's think about it goes up. If you were trying to decide between Coke and Pepsi, and typically those are $6 or $8 per 12 pack, right? And then you get there and Coke is now suddenly $12 per 12 pack and Pepsi is still the normal $6. You're more likely to choose Pepsi, right? Because they're substitutes. Now notice that we're not saying these are perfect substitutes. They're not necessarily exact substitutes for each other. You might prefer Coke slightly, but Pepsi is something you would consume instead if the price were right. And in this case, maybe that's exactly what's happening. So if the price of a substitute goes up, demand goes down. Another way to think about it is you go in, you're determined to pick up Coke this time, but it's $6. You look over and there's a big sale on Pepsi, right? It's, buy one, get one or something like that. So the effective price of the Pepsi drops dramatically. You might be induced to buy Pepsi. Now, again, some of you are saying, I'll only drink Coke. I'll never drink Pepsi. Some of you are saying the reverse. Nothing wrong with that. All these things are moderated by tastes and preferences. Okay, our next one's what we call number of buyers. So one of the things that we've done here in talking about markets is you can think of a demand curve for an individual, and we graphed that earlier. But at the end of the day, right, we add up everyone's demand curves, and that's how we get a market demand curve. So we see this very clearly when it comes to having the number of buyers play a factor. So this is exactly the relationship that you would expect. If the number of buyers goes up, that's going to increase demand. Okay. Our next two are related to what we call expectations, right? So expectations are you're looking forward into the future and you think something might happen. One expectation we might have is what the price is going to be. So we might have what we call expectations of future prices. What's the price going to be next week? A really good example of this is gasoline, right? Like we often think about what the price of gas is going to do over time. And so if the price of gas is getting higher in the future, then we'll buy more now. If the price of gas is lower in the future, we'll buy less now. So you have to remember to think about the demand curve. So expectation, there's the mathematical notation. So expectation of price. If that ends up rising, we're going to buy more now. So I'll put that parenthetically. Remember that this is the demand now, not the demand in the future. If we think the price is going to be higher in the future, our demand for it now will increase. If we think the price is going to be lower, then we'll wait and we'll go to buy it. A good example of this might be technology, right? So they announce that there's going to be an iPad 3, then the iPad 2s will be cheaper at some point, probably both at the time of the announcement and then in the future when those actually start coming out. So if you're content to buy an iPad 2, you don't have to have the newest iPad. You wait. When iPad 3 comes out, the price of iPad will fall. So if your expectation of the price in the future is that it's going to be lower, then your demand right now will be lower. Okay. Our other type of expectation is of income. So our expectation of future income. So this is really easy to teach in a college class. Almost everyone taking this class right now is doing some for their future income prospects in order to get a job, to make more money, etc. Hopefully a few of you are here just for your education and leisure, and you're taking this class just to learn more. So you'll have to imagine what the rest of the class is feeling in this moment. If you think that your income, remember we use the notation Y, if you think your income is going to go up, what might happen to your demand now? Well, for many of us, again, not all of us, because everybody has different preferences, your demand is likely to go up. Okay, a good way to think about this, you find out tomorrow that your great aunt has passed away and left you a large sum of money, and you'll get it at the beginning of next year. Your consumption, your spending over the next year might actually increase because you expect, well, I'll have this big influx of income in the future. And in fact, there's an idea related to this called consumption smoothing, which is people tend to want to have sort of similar consumption over a long period of time rather than periods of very, very low consumption and periods of very, very high consumption. So when we're lower income and we expect to be higher income in the future, we'll borrow more now and then we'll save more in the future. If you were expecting to make more income now and less in the future, then it would be the reverse. You'd save more now and you'd borrow more later, or maybe just use up the savings. Okay. So the last thing that I want to leave us with is sort of the trick question here. I'm going to put this on the exam. Probably all of you will face it. And it's because I want us to think carefully about what the relationship between, what the relationship of demand is, which is the relationship between price and quantity. So one of my favorite questions to ask is, would an increase in price, and I'll probably put some examples in here, would an increase in price cause the demand curve to shift? Right? So we've just spent all this time thinking about what things would cause demand to shift. Those are all what we call determinants of demand. And the answer to this is no. The answer is an increase in price won't cause the curve to shift because the curve is the relationship between price and quantity. So we'll move along the curve. So let's visualize that. There's our demand curve. What happens if we're initially at one price? Or initially at a quantity. What happens if the price changes? Price changes. We don't need to shift the curve. We already have this line which represents all the different relationships between price and quantity. So the price goes up, quantity goes down, and vice versa.